listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Welcome to Political Misfits here in Washington, D.C. on Radio Sputnik. We're connecting the political news, culture, and politics here in Washington, D.C. I'm Bob Schlaver here with my good friend Jamal Thomas. I'm all over the place, Jamal. We rushed a lot of news to cover today.
It's okay.
Can't even keep it straight here.
We'll bring it together.
We've got an exciting show here for everyone.
My name is Jamal Thomas. I am here with my co-host Bob Schlaver. Let's get ready to go against the grain. It's a slow news day, but we still have a bang-on show for today. In a moment, we're going to get to the Democratic primary news with the bombshell report by the New York Times on the plans of the Democratic Party to steal the election from Sanders. Democratic at this point is entirely ironic humor. We're also going to have a discussion to acknowledge to have a discussion on the coronavirus. That's going to be later in the show. But in the second hour, we're going to get the opportunity, providing that the gods are smiling upon us, to speak to the Colossus, Glen Ford. Now, hopefully, Glen Ford's voice holds up. He was having a little bit of difficulties this morning, but hopefully he can come and discuss the new anti-lynching law passed in 2020. Also, some of the press ethics around some of the suspensions that have taken place that has rocked mainstream media. We're also going to have immigration lawyer Jason Zubro to discuss some of the sanctuary cities and the attacks on those cities, not to mention, of course, our ongoing coverage of Julian Assange. But first, we have to start at what I consider to be the outrage of the morning. I am apoplectic, and I'm apoplectic despite knowing that this was the plan. This was the modus operandi. But every time I'm remembered or reminded of this, it aggravates me that much more. The New York Times had the opportunity to speak to 93 party officials, all of which were superdelegates. And what do you know? They found overwhelming opposition to handing Sanders the nomination if he won the most support and the most delegates, but fell short of the majority to win the nomination on the first ballot. For nearly a year, they asked Sanders over and over and over again, will you support the candidate that won? Will you support the candidate that won? And they're asking him this despite the fact that he stumped for Clinton, getting booed by his own supporters in order to boost Clinton, going to various states that Clinton couldn't even be bothered to go to, for example, Wisconsin, a state she lost. And yet they would continuously ask him that question. But now that he's the front runner, now he's the one that everybody on that stage recognizes and accepts will most likely win the delegates or the nomination either outright or by the plurality. Now, everybody is dodgy on whether or not they're going to back Sanders. I call the left the politically abused spouse of the political space because the left assiduously backed candidates that was against their interests in regards to being within the context of the Democratic Party. Bill Clinton looked the left in the eye and said, you have nowhere else to go. Fall in line. Yeah, you're going to back me when I destroy welfare. Yeah, you're going to back me when I go about repealing Glass-Steagall and deregulating Wall Street. Yeah, you're going to back me when I explode the prison population because you have nowhere else to go and the monsters are in the other party. And the left fell in line and backed one candidate after the next that for the most part was against their interests. And now the world has changed. Now you have a situation where a lefty is legit. A lefty has the best chance of winning this race. And by Bloomberg's own words, Sanders would have ran away with it in 2016, but now they don't want to back that lefty. We were told that Donald Trump is eating babies and kicking puppies, but now the existential threat is not Trump anymore, at least based on party insiders. The threat is Sanders. This is astonishing. The New York Times reports from California to the Carolinas and North Dakota to Ohio, the party leaders say they worry that Mr. Sanders, a quote-unquote Democratic socialist with passionate but limited support so far, would lose to President Trump and drag down moderates in the House and the Senate candidates in swing states with his left wing agenda of Medicare for all and 4 more years of public college, or 4 years of public college. Jay Jacobs, New York Democrat Party chairman and superdelegate, echoing many others interviewed, said the superdelegates should choose the nominee they believe had the best chance of beating Mr. Trump if no candidate wins a majority of delegates during the primaries. How extraordinary this is. How extraordinary. And how shallow your memories. Al Gore, lost. John Kerry, lost. Hillary Clinton, lost. Lost to a reality show host. And to put that one in perspective, the last loss by Hillary Clinton, she lost 1,100 seats all throughout the United States. She lost the House, she lost the Senate, and she lost the presidency. And the party was so weak, so feckless, that they wouldn't even fight for their own Supreme Court pick, a pick that belonged to Obama that he couldn't be bothered to fight for. And after 3 years of not shutting up about Clinton getting 3 million more votes, and a democracy being one man or one woman and one vote, only 9 out of the 93 unaccountable, unelected superdelegates believe that the person who gets the most votes, who has the most support, should actually win the nomination. You know, democracy. Let's never forget the reasons for superdelegates. Listen to Deborah Wasserman-Schultz explain why superdelegates exist.
Well, let me just make sure that I can clarify exactly what was available during the primaries in Iowa and in New Hampshire. The unpledged delegates are a separate category. The only thing available on the ballot in a primary and a caucus is the pledged delegates, those that are tied to the candidate that they are pledged to support, and they receive a proportional number of delegates going into our convention. Unpledged delegates exist really to make sure that party leaders and elected officials don't have to be in a position where they are running against grassroots activists. We are, as a Democratic Party, really highlight and emphasize inclusiveness and diversity at our convention, and so we want to give every opportunity to grassroots activists and diverse, committed Democrats to be able to participate, attend, and be a delegate at the convention. And so we separate out those unpledged delegates to make sure that there isn't competition between them.
I'm not sure that answer would satisfy an anxious young.
Yeah. Jake Tapper even gets it. Yeah, I'm not sure that answer would satisfy anybody. I mean, basically, you've just said that the purpose of superdelegates is to stop grassroots insurgencies within the context of the Democratic Party. Meaning, the whole point of superdelegates is for the party itself to be able to choose and rip it away from somebody that may be popular, but that the insiders don't particularly like. It's the third way Democrats' way of maintaining control over the political edifice. And this, in a literal sense, is what has taken place. Sanders, whatever you want to think of him, is heading a coalition where, based on the new polling by Reuters and even Morning Consult, he is winning the black vote. He is winning the Hispanic vote by almost double digits. He is winning the white vote. He has put together a working class coalition, an organization, and a coalition, by the way, that the Democratic Party is supposed to philosophically represent. It is absolutely apparent that you can make a determination on who people are, not just based on what they say, but what they do. And if the guy who's pushing is saying healthcare is a human right, let's have Medicare for all, let's expand college and get rid of this debt that's on people's back. Let's ensure that workers have more agency in the context of the jobs that they work and they make more income. And let's make sure that people, after using all of their energies for the entirety of their life, dumping that into the society in the form of labor, that they don't have to retire broke, destitute. The Democratic Party says, screw that. We don't want that guy. And with all the powers at their disposal and some of the most anti-democratic processes imaginable, going through with trying to stop the will of the public. Last night, Elizabeth Warren in South Carolina was basically asked, how do you justify remaining in the race? I mean, after all, you're not the one with the most votes. Now, initially, back in 2018, politically opportunistic weather vane Warren defended this notion that superdelegates shouldn't exist. She made the argument on a tweet. Democracy hangs on the idea that those who get the most votes should win. Politicians are supposed to compete over how many voters they can persuade, not how many they can disqualify or demoralize. Well, that's interesting. In another statement on superdelegates a year or so ago, Warren said the following, that she doesn't believe in superdelegates.
The Massachusetts Democrats just voted on a resolution, they just passed a resolution to scrutinize the superdelegate process ahead of the 2020 election. Do you think that that process deserves that type of scrutiny?
Yes, I do. I'm a superdelegate, and I don't believe in superdelegates. I don't think that superdelegates ought to sway the election.
Agree with her. I don't think superdelegates ought to sway the election. But fast forward, weather vane, politically opportunistic Warren on Stop Sanders crusade with the other members of the party says this.
So you do know that was Bernie's position in 2016?
Not necessarily, no.
Yeah.
He won 22 states, so he went to the convention.
That was
for
Bernie's
voters.
position in 2016, that it should not go to the person who had a plurality.
Yep.
So, and remember, his last play was to superdelegates. So the way I see this is you write the rules before you know where everybody stands, and then you stick with those rules. So for me, Bernie had a big hand in writing these rules. I didn't write them. But Bernie did when they were putting together the 2016 platform for the Democratic Convention. Those are the rules that he wanted to write and others wanted to write. Everybody got in the race thinking that was the set of rules. I don't see how come you get to change it just because he now thinks there's an advantage to him for doing it.
This woman is massively
So listen, Senator Warren,
and fundamentally dishonest. Whether it's the Native American thing, whether it's her kids not going to public schools, her kids went to private school despite whatever she told that woman, despite the super PAC thing where she acted like the men that because these guys, the people with the penises on stage had their super PACs, that she had to all of a sudden keep her super PAC. She's acting as if our revolution is somehow some kind of super PAC and the dark money organization. She has been fundamentally and flagrantly dishonest in the context of running this particular race, and it doesn't stop here. Meaning, or it doesn't stop there. Meaning, what she's saying here is patently, to some degree, untrue. The Unity Reform Commission was the commission that was brought together at the end of the 2016 race where they cheated Sanders. Donna Brazile, or let's say Deborah Wasserman-Schultz, the person you heard before, got fired from her job for being corrupt. Donna Brazile got fired from CNN because she was handing notes over to Hillary Clinton on things that were going to be asked during the course of the debate. She was not, however, too corrupt to get a job as a head of the DNC chair, whereby, upon hawking a book, made it very clear of the malfeasance that was involved in that particular race. The Unity Reform Commission was the way of trying to bring the party back together by having a segment of Sanders supporters and a segment of Clinton supporters come up and write the rules for a platform and those type of things. In fact, this is Nomiki Konst. Nomiki Konst was having a conversation in regards to the Unity Reform Commission in regards to the budget, meaning the Sanders people didn't have the lay of the land on that. They were the weaker hand on that. The Sanders people wanted to get rid of superdelegates. Let's be very clear on that. The Democratic Party and the insiders did not want to lose their power in regards to the superdelegates, so they tried to keep them. The deal that they worked out wasn't to get rid of them, wasn't even to cut the number of superdelegates, but to put them in the second round. Now, my argument was, just because you put them in the second round doesn't mean you've won anything, because those things are going to come back in full force the moment that somebody runs that they don't particularly like, i.e. Sanders. The Democratic Party in 2016 said in court they could pick a person in a smoke-filled room. They can cheat, steal, whatever they needed to do. This was part of the political space, and it wasn't necessarily anything you could do about it. So would that particular party do everything at their disposal to stop a particular candidate that they didn't want in 2016? Lord knows they don't necessarily want in 2020. Where clearly, patently, that answer is yes. You have big money donors trying to get Nancy Pelosi and Schumer to rally the troops in order to stop Sanders. You have people screaming for Obama to throw his body into the race, again, to stop Sanders, the job that Tom Perez had, that Bill Clinton told him to stop Sanders, don't let Sanders take the party. All of it is now coming to fruition. All of it is coming to a reckoning. The truth is, though, even going further than this notion that Sanders wanted to get rid of superdelegates, even her basic point that Sanders' position was ultimately to rip it away from Clinton was not even true. Listen to Sanders in 2016 discuss the very thing of superdelegates, the thing that Warren and the other party members are arguing about.
A superdelegate is thinking about going to you, but Hillary Clinton won their state. Presumably, they should stick with Hillary Clinton.
Look, there's not a rigid rule, but I think, if you win, Hillary Clinton wins with 53% of the vote. She won Illinois by a point or two, sure. But when a candidate, whether it's Clinton or myself, she demolished us in Mississippi, I think the superdelegates should support her in Mississippi. But when in states like Colorado and in many other states, Utah, etc., we win the overwhelming majority of vote, I think those superdelegates should go with their state.
Why is he saying that? Because there were situations where Sanders would dominate, and yet they would walk away with basically the same number of delegates as if Sanders didn't win anything at all. The superdelegates, the Clinton lobbyists, the Clinton supporters, the lobbyists, the insiders, all of these particular people would back Clinton despite Sanders winning various states overwhelmingly, whether that was Vermont or I think he gave the example of Colorado. Let's hear Sanders again talk about this. Here's another clip.
I'm going to try to convince those superdelegates when it's all said and done to go with you instead of Hillary Clinton. You've made a distinction between superdelegates from states you've won, that you think those superdelegates should go for you. So will you not try to convince any superdelegate who comes from a state that you did not win in the primary and caucus process?
Right. Look, this is what I think. If I win, or Hillary Clinton, if that is your point, Hillary Clinton won Mississippi by a huge vote. Should I convince superdelegates there to vote for me when she won that state overwhelmingly? No, I shouldn't. But we won states, like Washington, Alaska, Hawaii, New Hampshire, in landslide victories. And I do believe that the superdelegates, whether it's, Clinton's or mine, states that we won, superdelegates in states where a candidate wins a landslide victory should listen to the people in those states and vote for the candidate chosen by the people.
That sounds like rational democracy to me. What Warren is saying, patently, is just dishonest. Ultimately, Sanders' basic argument was, I win a state outright, and the superdelegates ends up giving the state to either Clinton or us breaking even. How is that fair? Now, again, Sanders' camp was the camp that was trying to get rid of superdelegates. The Democratic Party didn't want to get rid of superdelegates, and now you can see why. But moments just like this, when they have a person who represents the interests of the poor, of the working class, a broad coalition of the poor and working class, constituencies that were supposed to be part of the Democratic Party, those constituencies are now standing outside the building trying to take their party back, with the party doing everything in their power at their disposal to prevent that large working class majority of blacks, whites, Hispanics, effectively a working class coalition of people, from trying to take and reinsole the party to represent their material interests and concerns. What does it say? What does it say if the party is fighting this hard to stop this many people? Bob, what did you think about this? I mean, ultimately, we're talking about superdelegates, and we're talking about literally unelected, unaccountable people who have the votes of thousands of regular human beings and using them to effectively hold back Sanders and his supporters from taking the nomination.
Yeah, I mean, it's remarkable. In 2016, unpledged delegates in the Democratic Party went to Hillary Clinton 591, Sanders 48.
Yeah.
And so at the end of the whole process, if you just had it without the superdelegates, Clinton and Sanders are just, I mean, a few hundred votes apart from each other, the delegate math working out. And then all of a sudden, when you add 591 to a few hundred-point lead, all of a sudden she's up by 1,000. And that completely shifts the conversation around what is the Democratic Party.
Yeah.
You know, I struggle on this in some regards. People often feel, and it's people that are independents, not registered part of the Democratic Party, they feel that they still should have a say in the Democratic Party. And I think I always try to remind people the Democratic Party is an institution, it's an organization, it's a membership club.
It's a corporation.
They have plenty of meetings that you can attend all the time. It's an active, engaged thing. Obviously, it's not serving that function. It's not a party in the sense of people are coming together, writing policies, being active, writing laws, trying to coalesce different people. All those things is more of just kind of vanity branding and party scene here and across the country. I mean, they're selling tickets to debates and stuff, right? It's not about like who should be in the debate room, because then we go out and after. I mean, if they're like serious about the party, they would just have the debate on like PBS or on just like a neutral channel, public access channel. They wouldn't sell ads to it
Women's League of
and have
Voters.
corporations come in and run it and stuff. I mean, there'd be a whole different framework to it. My point being, there's so many people that think that they should have a voice and a say of what happens in the Democratic Party, and you don't.
Yeah.
That's just not how it works. If you're not a registered Democrat and you don't go to party meetings, like I don't care. Like your opinion on the Democratic primary doesn't matter as much. And I think the Democratic Party, as flawed as the whole overall system is, it's kind of like don't hate the player, hate the game, where these people are just playing within a just dramatically broken political system here in the United States. And so for me to call out these superdelegates, it's like, yeah, that's the club they run and break the thing up, but they have every right to do it. And I think that's kind of what they say. It's like, hey, we're just following the rules here. The rules are broken. And so that is where it's hard, though. But it's like, yeah, they set the... I know that's what I struggle with, because it's like in some part, it's like we need to identify these people can do whatever they want because the system's broken. It's not them. It's the broader system. And then part of me is like, what you're saying is like, well, within the system, they're not being honest brokers.
That's like making the argument, that's like arguing about capitalism to some degree. Is it fair for 95% of the income gains to go to the top 1% despite the fact all of the labor and work that people put into the process? And somebody's like, hey, man, hate the player, hate the game, not the player. And it's like, well, yeah, but those rules are written. Those aren't created by God. There's no magical thinking for this. They set those rules. They put those. You heard Deborah Wasserman-Schultz. She was very clear. They are in this in order to prevent the grassroots from taking over the party, and that's effectively what they are serving.
Yeah, and we talked about that yesterday too, like what that actually looks like. I still can't imagine if you just take Washington D.C., because I can speak to the experiences here. A lot of the people I know that work with the Democratic Party in Washington D.C. will not support Bernie Sanders, and a lot of the people, the Democratic Socialist of America people that are here in Washington D.C., they're not Democrats. They don't go to Democratic Party meetings, and so what would it actually look like to hand over the keys, or even have a hybrid mix where DSA members are all of a sudden like, nope, we're the Democrat? Because what does Bernie Sanders do if he comes and does a rally in Washington, D.C.? Does he call up the Democratic Party, or does he call up DSA members and come out? And so this compromise that's going to have to unfold is going to be fascinating to see if people say, no, it's going to be more established Democrats or longtime Democrats that are burn down this thing before Bernie Sanders comes in and like burns down the thing. Because he needs that machine. He needs the apparatus to get things done. Sanders needs the Democratic Party in some form or fashion if he is the nominee, where people that aren't a part of the Sanders thing that are Democrats are like, screw it, let's take our keys, burn the building down, and leave. They're, for me, the ones that we have to keep an eye on. Let's take a quick break, because I want to talk about South Carolina. We've got a lot of show ahead of us. You're listening to Political Misfits on Radio Sputnik live in Washington, D.C. We're back after this.
We call Fault Lines with Nixon and Stranahan the most disruptive radio show in America.
It's a great show, and we have a lot of fun.
We come to you live from Washington, D.C. every Monday through Friday morning.
What I like best is that we bring in experts from all over the world. From Barcelona, from Egypt, from Seoul, South Korea.
From Newark, New Jersey. We try to bring people great guests, great calls from our listeners, and, of course, stupid jokes. And we do it with two hosts that have very different viewpoints. Now, here's the thing, Garland. A lot of people would think you and I would just argue. I mean, I'm a Republican Trump supporter.
And, of course, I am a progressive Democrat Bernie Sanders supporter.
The surprising thing is how much we actually agree on.
And you won't be surprised, because you're going to find out just how much you agree and just how much you enjoy this show.
Welcome back to Political Misfits on Radio Sputnik, where we bring you news, politics, and culture without the red and blue treatment. I am Bob Schlehuber here with Jamarl Thomas. We've been talking about the latest from the Democratic political party's effort to try to find a front-runner ahead of South Carolina's primary tomorrow. The New York Times story revealing that inside Democratic Party officials and superdelegates are happy and willing to do whatever they can to stop Bernie Sanders from getting the party's nomination. Give us a call, 202-521-1320. We're going to talk a little bit about immigration and Julian Assange here towards the next half hour. So we did want to just talk here briefly about the latest from South Carolina ahead of the votes there tomorrow. Democratic Party is under attack by Republicans, allegedly. Reuters reports that Republican activists in South Carolina are urging Republican voters to support Bernie Sanders in the state's Democratic primary on Saturday. I know it sounds confusing, but stay with us here. In the first press release on the matter, the folks behind Operation Chaos, who include Stephen Brown, the former chairman of the Greenville County GOP. He writes, "We are doing this openly and loudly to make a very public protest in opposition to open primaries." So in South Carolina, there's open primaries. You can pick which primary you want to go and vote in. Other states have closed primaries where you have to only allowed to vote in the primary that you are registered party-wise. So Stephen Brown says, we're going to call baloney on this. He goes on to say, "We want the South Carolina General Assembly to change the election laws to permit certified political parties to hold closed primaries. While our first objective is to protest open primaries, our second objective is to assist the re-election of the president by extending and exasperating the division among the Democrats. For decades now, South Carolina Democrats have meddled in our primaries, voting for the weakest Republican candidates and canceling out votes for the conservative candidates. We want them to understand how serious and egregious this is, Jamal. It's egregious. Stop laughing." Open Chaos later announced their choice for Republicans in the Democratic primary, Bernie Sanders. Why? Check this out. Brown says, "We as Republicans think there is a very reasonable chance that Democrats might deny the nomination of Bernie Sanders. And if they were to do that, we believe that it would enrage the left, cause the Democratic Party to split, and only help Donald Trump in his reelection." That's right. Republicans in South Carolina have figured out what we're all talking about, that taking the nomination from Bernie Sanders will only help Donald Trump get reelected. But that's not the point of the election. It's to keep Democratic power where Democratic Party belongs, in the hands of billionaires. So Reuters, though, on the other hand, Jamal, I thought was interesting. They said that the reason that these Republicans in South Carolina were going for Bernie Sanders is they thought that he would be the best person to face Donald Trump for Trump to get reelected, that Sanders was actually the weakest of all of the Democratic candidates. So Reuters obviously not paying attention to any polls or outcomes of any election so far. And so that's the reason why. So it's interesting that you have kind of a different take on why people would vote in here. This obviously comes as yesterday Jane Sanders was recycled that she was on RT about 4 years ago with Ed Schultz, who is now passed, talking about open primaries. So this open primary story here, Jamal, I just want to know if Bernie Sanders wins South Carolina, upsets Joe Biden tomorrow, was it because of the Republicans?
No, usually this stuff is just around the edges.
Nobody goes and votes in the first place, let alone is like trying to do some crazy intricate math of like, I mean, the idea that like people are afraid of voter fraud. We can't get people to vote once in this country. You think people are driving to multiple states to vote multiple times on one day? Get out of here.
50% of the population don't vote in a presidential election. I mean, in 2016, I mean, I know I made that argument in the monologue, but you must understand there was thousands, like hundreds of thousands, that did not vote. They would vote down ticket and would not vote for the presidency for Clinton or Trump because they couldn't bring themselves to do it. I've made the argument that Sanders is going to win South Carolina, and that, you know, there have been a lot of polls that have come out like over the last few days. But keep in mind, polling is not done entirely just to give you information. It's also done in order to push your opinion of things. I think it's called Schofield, and I need to look up the specific term for it. But basically, people get their information around by other people, meaning they observe reality, what reality is, based on what other people are doing. And sometimes polling is put out there in order to influence the person's opinion. That's why it's fought so hard over the notion of superdelegates and those things being awarded in advance. Just so we're clear, though, Hillary Clinton used a similar tactic in order to try to get Trump elected, this Pied Piper strategy. Well, we saw what happened. The person who they put up was the person who ends up losing. If you look at the polling, swing states, Trump loses to Sanders in 4 out of the 5 swing states, only drawing even in Wisconsin. I mean, this is the overwhelming majority of the polls that show these two in a matchup. Trump loses. So be very careful. If Republicans want to do it, have at it. It's an open state. You guys can vote for whoever you want to vote for. But fact of the matter is, I think Trump is right, that the person he would have the most hardest time with that matches his strengths, or at the very least undermines his strengths, by the same token, not having the weaknesses of corruption of Joe Biden, not having the weaknesses of non-disclosure agreements and racism of Bloomberg. And the moment that you take Biden and Bloomberg off the table, it becomes difficult to find anybody else who's even there. And so you have this broad, expansive coalition of blacks, whites, Asians, Hispanics, without alienating the other members of the coalition. Should not the poor and the middle class get a party that actually represents their interests, as opposed to having an oligarch trying to buy it? If Sanders wins South Carolina, this race is over. Just know it. Biden is going to resign. I mean, he's going to be out of it. And I don't know the argument that they're going to make going into Super Tuesday from the bump he's going to get with just in those few days of taking South Carolina, a state that Joe Biden was winning by like 30 points at one point. He can take it. I mean, you can look at the polls. He's within a couple of points away. Sanders has taken the black vote by Reuters polling. By Morning Consult, he's taken the black vote. Now, whether that is specific to South Carolina as across the nation, it's almost secondary to the point. I've argued I fetishize trends. Why? Because I think when a trend breaks, then you see movement one way or the other in the polling. The trend that Joe Biden has had has been the domination of the black vote for the past year. And now that trend is coming unglued. What that means is this notion of electability that I've made the point before, the African-American vote is who keeps the monsters at bay. And the moment that you saw movement on this notion of Joe Biden and electability, you saw movement from the standpoint of African-Americans moving to Sanders. So, look, you know, it could go either way. Biden could totally take it. This is the state that
no, either way. Don't give us either way tomorrow.
Well,
Which way does it go?
Personally, I think Sanders is going to win it.
All right.
By the same token, but I think he's going to win it because of the breaking of those trends in regards that was keeping him secure in that lead. By the same token, Biden was up by like 20 points in South Carolina, so it's possible that he could take it, but my bet is on Sanders. And
it's hard to know. I mean, again, this is all about turnout for Sanders at the end of the day. If you talk about super voters, if that's who was polled as like longtime old black voters in South Carolina, Joe Biden's going to be up 20 points in all of your polls.
Yeah.
But if you're not polling all of the people that weren't polled in Nevada, that ended up leaving like a 17-point bump for Sanders after the polls, that the last ones that came out for what actually happened. It's a whole different story. We know a lot of people that are on the ground there in South Carolina. Will have full coverage here on Political Misfits Monday with all of the results ahead of Tuesday's big Super Tuesday, March 3rd votes. Jamarl Thomas is excited.
I would love to do that.
Too.
I would love to run that here. But like you said, that thing is not going to be, it's like 3 in the morning.
It's too late. But you'll be there on the Progressive Soapbox for all of those to watch on YouTube. Thank you for all of those listening and watching us here in Washington, D.C. We're going to go to another break before we come back, talking about sanctuary cities and the latest efforts for Donald Trump to destroy any semblance of humanity here in the United States. We'll be back after this.
What's the most important hour of the day? It's the Critical Hour with Dr. Wilmer Leon. On this show, we don't just deliver the latest headlines, we divide the real from the fake. Tune in to hear from some of the most brilliant political minds of today, get in-depth news and analysis that goes beyond the surface and dig straight into the details. Set your clock to the Critical Hour for a news perspective unlike any of those other guys. Tune in to the Critical Hour with Dr. Wilmer Leon, weekdays 6 to 7 p.m. Eastern, and catch us on Facebook Live. You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
Welcome back to Political Misfits, the show that goes against the grain. I'm Bob Schlehuber here with Jamarl Thomas, and we are about to go to the Trump administration's latest win. Yes, a win in the courts for Donald Trump regarding punishing sanctuary cities by withholding federal grant money from them. Yesterday, a 3-judge panel of the Second U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals in New York ruled that the federal government can refuse to hand over funds for fighting crime to cities and states that refuse to share information with federal immigration authorities. These states and cities are often known as sanctuary cities. The decision reverses a lower court ruling. Here to talk more about that is Jason Zubo, an immigration attorney, partner at Zubo and Pilcher, PLLC, and blogger at theasylumist.com. Jason, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me.
It's a treat to have you on here, as I produced for a long time there at By Any Means Necessary to always have you on that show to be able to talk to you on the radio. It's an honor, and I'm glad to introduce you to all of those listening, as you are an expert on asylum cases here in the United States and so much more around immigration. We did want to talk about this latest ruling here, talking about how Donald Trump is legally, according to this first court here, allowed to withhold grant funds to cities and states that are sanctuary cities. The Department of Justice spokesperson said of the decision, Wednesday's decision rightfully recognizes the lawful authority of the Attorney General to ensure that the Department of Justice grant recipients are not at the same time thwarting federal law enforcement priorities. The grant conditions here require states and cities that receive Department of Justice grants to share information about criminals in custody. The federal government uses this information to enforce national immigration laws, policies supported by successive Democrat and Republican administrations. So as I mentioned, Jason, this latest decision conflicts with rulings from other appeals courts across the country concerning sanctuary policies, indicating a Supreme Court review is ultimately likely. One area of contention within this debate is whether or not states or federal government maintains ultimate power and say over immigration policy. Jason, maybe start at a 30,000-foot view of where things stand regarding immigration in the United States, and then zoom in on how this latest decision shapes or changes anything currently taking place.
Yeah, thank you. Right now, obviously, it's a pretty broad-based war on immigrants by the Trump administration, and this is just taking all different forms, and this is just one of those forms, which is to try to force sanctuary cities to comply with the federal government's policy of providing information to law enforcement. And, of course, there's good reason why sanctuary cities don't want to do that. I mean, the most commonly cited reason, and I think the reason that really makes the most logical sense, is that when you are targeting immigrant communities in this way, they're much less likely to cooperate with law enforcement, and this is really a problem. Like there's definitely statistics these days of crime in immigrant communities being less likely to be reported to the police because there's a fear. And even in sanctuary cities, immigrants aren't always aware of that they're protected. So there's a fear within immigrant communities of the federal government, and I think we're going to see this play out.
And I just want to say on that note, too, there's a fear often of undocumented people even going to see doctors or getting medical support if they think that could lead to them being detained and deported.
I think that's right. And in fact, now with the coronavirus coming in the news and potentially, I guess now arriving at the U.S. shores, immigrants may be fearful of going to the doctor to get treatment, and that, of course, would increase the likelihood of the virus spreading. So for many reasons, it's just a bad policy, but, there are counter arguments to that, which is the Trump administration claims that, the people who are targeted specifically by this current Second Circuit case are people who have been arrested for crimes or convicted of crimes and they're incarcerated. And so, the Trump administration's argument is, well, these are criminals and we need to deport them. We need to have the information available to get them when they're being released, and we need to be able to interview them while they're in custody. It's debatable whether that actually protects communities, and I think the weight of the evidence seems to be that it doesn't. But it's just sort of one facet of this very broad-based war, which is forcing immigrants to feel like second-class citizens and to be fearful of all law enforcement, which, of course, increases the likelihood of criminals not being reported, like crimes not being reported to the police. So from a policy point of view, I think this is a bad policy. The Second Circuit kind of addressed that issue about policy when they talked about in the decision whether this rule by the Trump administration was arbitrary and capricious. And what that essentially means is that if it's not based on a valid, legitimate reason, it might not be enforceable. In other words, so if there's no valid reason for the federal government to want this information about immigrants, the states would have a better argument in terms of refusing to comply with the federal government's requests. But the Second Circuit said that no, it's not arbitrary and capricious. There are legitimate reasons that have been articulated. Whether those reasons are sort of outweigh the negatives, I mean, in my opinion, they don't. I mean, I think that the reason for getting this information is just to put fear into immigrant communities, and I don't think it does much to provide public safety. But that's not actually the legal standard that the Second Circuit is looking at. They're looking at a much lower legal standard that has the federal government articulated a basis for this law that's not arbitrary and capricious, and they said that the federal government has done that, and they allowed the law to go forward, and they ruled in favor of the Trump administration's withholding these grants to New York and other cities.
Jason, what's the opposition to this? Meaning, I hear a lot of kids in cages and everything else, but what has been the, let's say, organized opposition to Trump in this particular policy? And one more thing with this, I'm always weirded out by the way we talk about immigration law or immigration as an issue, we always isolate it entirely to people coming to our shores without necessarily the things that we're doing outside of those shores that incentivize and even create environments, especially the collapsing or attacking of other governments that have those people coming to our shores. Can you discuss that? I mean, the Democratic Party's opposition to this, meaning Trump or the organization of opposition to whatever Trump is trying to do with this, but also how our policy, especially foreign policy, especially in the sense of South America, adversely affect our immigration situation.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is really an important point that you're raising. It's a policy point. It's not really a legal point so much. But from the policy point of view, you certainly can trace some of the problems, particularly in countries like, El Salvador, Honduras, Guatemala. I mean, these are countries where the gangs like the MS-13 gang are dominant. They're very, very harmful to people who live there, and they're really driving a lot of the migration to the United States. But the MS-13 gang did not start in El Salvador; it started in the United States among El Salvadoran expat communities, and people were deported back to that country, and that helped spread the gang. And also, of course, could talk about the governments we supported, especially in the 1980s in El Salvador and Guatemala, these very right-wing, very authoritarian and harsh governments, which were very oppressive to the people, and it created difficult conditions, economic domination of Central America, really going back, to the Monroe Doctrine, I guess, going back more than 100, 150 years. So a lot of the policies of the United States have not, let's say, contributed to the welfare of Central America and Mexico in terms of allowing those countries to kind of be left alone and just to develop as they might naturally have done. And the result of that is, or part of the result of that is that you have conditions there that are violent and that are dangerous. People are fleeing those conditions because people flee violent conditions. They want a safe place to live for themselves, for their children. And so, there is that aspect of the whole immigration debate. And to me, that is a moral issue in that, if we do something that's harmful to another country, and maybe at the time we had a reason that we legitimately thought that was the best thing to do, or we had to do it even. But even if that was the case, if we have done harm, it seems to me we have a moral responsibility to then provide help for the harm that we have done or try to help improve the situation.
Jason, what's a secondary outcome for this? Meaning, oftentimes when a ruling gets put through, there are ancillary consequences for the ruling. So, for example, would this allow a president, let's say it's not about immigration, let's say it's about, climate change, or let's say it's about implementing some kind of medical policy within the context of a Republican state. Would this ruling also lean into those particular policies? Meaning, does this allow the president, for the most part, to withhold funding for a wide range of things, not just for immigration?
I mean, it's a good question, and the question here is pretty specific to, there's this grant money that's available, and the federal government has put conditions on it, but your point is well taken, which is, well, what if the Trump administration decides that they don't think that the vaccines are necessary for children or that they're bad for children? Because then if states are trying to obtain federal money for vaccination grants, could the federal government then block them if they're not doing it the way that the federal government wants? And the answer is, potentially that precedent could be expanded in a direction that goes beyond immigration. I think, what's so interesting now about the immigration debate is, in the past, like the conservative position was always state rights, and that largely had to do with trying to oppose the implementation of civil rights legislation from the federal government. But now the states' rights argument is from the left, which is we as a state or a city have decided we want to protect immigrants because we feel like we know our community, and we feel like if we don't protect immigrants, they will go underground. They won't report crimes. It'll make our city less safe. And the federal government is essentially taking an anti-state rights position. So the whole kind of paradigm that has existed in terms of like left, right, and states' rights versus federal government has been reversed on a lot of this stuff.
Jason, another big story out of the Justice Department yesterday was that the Department of Justice has created an official section within its immigration office to strip citizenship rights from naturalized immigrants. Just wanted to get your thoughts here as we have a few minutes left.
Yeah, this is a really horrible development, in my opinion. I mean, we have actually been seeing this. There already was the ability to strip citizenship from people who have status, and you would see it in cases like John Jumanjic, who was a Nazi war criminal. He lied about his past history, and then it was eventually discovered he was finally stripped of his citizenship and deported. But I've been seeing it as an immigration lawyer, even from just normal. There was someone who came to my office who was from a West African country. He had a birth certificate. He had been a citizen for about 25 years. Somehow the U.S. government had pulled an old birth certificate which came from a rural part of his country, and they decided that there was something wrong with it, and so they were refusing to renew his passport. So he was stuck in this sort of bureaucratic nightmare. And now, the government already had indicated that they were going to try to be going back and looking at applications which were allegedly fraudulent. But they hadn't created a particular unit for that within the Department of Justice, and now they have, which essentially means, I guess, that they'll be devoting more resources to that. But what it ultimately means is for people who have U.S. citizenship, who've gotten citizenship through naturalization, is they cannot really rest easy and feel that they're part of the club. I mean, they will always be viewed somehow as suspect or as outsiders, which to me is very antithetical to what America is about. I mean, this is a nation of immigrants. This is a nation of people who've come from all different parts of the world. They've contributed their brilliance and their culture to our society. And some parts of our country accept that and are happy, and it's really benefiting us. And other parts of the country seem to be threatened by that and are I guess currently have the power to oppose that and to cause real harm to people who are just law-abiding, doing their thing. And it's just really, I think, a very unfortunate and potentially dangerous development for our country.
That's Jason Zubo. Jason runs the blog asylumist.com. Jason, I want to just point it out. I liked your list here, 10 immigration predictions for 2020. You said number one here, all asylum grant letters will now feature a photo of Donald Trump giving you the finger, which sounds about right after we just talked about the latest Department of Justice rulings. I'm not sure if that one's come through, but if anybody wants to read the rest of the list, they can check out Jason Zubo's work at theasylumist.com. He's an immigration attorney, partner, and a partner at Zubo and Pilcher PLLC. Jason, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Congratulations on the new show.
Greatly appreciated. We'll be back after this here with Political Misfits live in Washington, D.C. We're back after this.
Stuck in traffic? No problem. Stay informed. Stay tuned to Radio Sputnik on 105.5 FM or 1390 AM in the Washington, D.C. area. Need more? Follow us on Facebook or check us out on SputnikNews.com.
Tune in every Thursday to Loud and Clear with Brian Becker for a regular segment called Criminal Injustice about the most egregious conduct of our courts and how justice is denied to so many people in this country. Tune in to Loud and Clear this Thursday and every Thursday for thorough and independent analysis of our criminal injustice system.
Welcome back to Political Misfits on Radio Sputnik, where we bring you news, politics, and culture without the red and blue treatment. My name is Jamal Thomas. I'm here with my co-host, Bob Schlehuber. We've been talking about Sanctuary City's verdict that would allow the Trump administration to withhold money from cities that won't share data on immigrants. But now, let's get to our daily update on Assange. Give us a call at 202-521-1320. That's 202-521-1320. If you have anything to say on these topics or whatever else is on your mind. We were talking about the Democratic primary earlier, so definitely feel free to give us a call. So we're heading into the fourth day of testimony in the extradition trial of political prisoner and publisher Julian Assange. A little after noon on London time today, Assange was back in a glass cage in the back of the courtroom. Assange noting he was no more a participant in his own hearing than a spectator at Wimbledon. The prosecution resumed its argument from Wednesday, insisting that Assange's prosecution is not related to political offenses. Now, this seems like a ludicrous argument on its face, as there were political consequences from Assange's reporting, but the prosecution is forced to make this particular argument due to the treaty between the United States and the UK making extradition concerning political offenses illegal. James Lewis, arguing for the United States, says Assange's aim would have to have been to change the U.S. government for his quote-unquote crime to be a political offense. The defense arguing, what other reason would he be there to publish murders, tortures, mass surveillance, and assassinations were it not to change the policy and the tenor of the government by revealing the onerous behavior to the masses? To discuss, we have Sputnik correspondent Walter Smolarek at the scene. Walter, thank you for joining us.
Glad to be here.
Excellent. So, Walter, we've been talking to you for the last few days. You've had the opportunity to interview Kevin Gostala. Hopefully I'm getting that name correct, who is the managing editor of Shadowproof. Here's a conversation with Kevin outside of the courtroom in London.
Today we heard the prosecution lawyers say that the political offenses exemption is outdated. What do you think about that comment?
I don't think it bodes very well for the people of the United Kingdom who are waking up to this fact that the UK prosecutor who is advancing this request on behalf of the United States is suggesting that there may not be a protection in extradition law that can guard against arbitrary detention and that can be used to stand up for political dissidents, to protect people who are on the wrong side of government. I mean, typically this has been in law so that people could have some protection if they were involved in, I imagine, human rights work, journalism, or representing people who were targets of a state government. And the prosecutor is saying you can ignore that even though there's a mutual understanding between the United States and the United Kingdom around allowing this political offense exception because the United States wants it. If someone in the UK is facing extradition and they would be covered, the United States government would absolutely stand up for that individual. They may even use it to try and cover someone who was aligned with US government.
Also, yesterday there was a dispute about where Julian Assange was going to sit in court. Today, this morning, we saw he's still in that bulletproof box. Do you know what happened?
We don't have a lot of clarity. What we do understand is the defense made a request to the judge in order to get some kind of a ruling that would allow Julian Assange to sit with them in the well. And so for people who don't know how the court is laid out, we have a glass box in the back on the opposite end from the judge. There's a public gallery, and then there's a box for the press. And in the middle, we have a well where the defense and prosecution's sitting, and it's connected. And Julian Assange wants to be with his attorneys to consult them and to also have private conversations with them, potentially, because the security guards are always leering over him, eavesdropping on what he's saying. Even if he whispers, they are eavesdropping. And so they asked the judge for a remedy, and she proposed, in order to avoid really dealing with this issue, let's give you a headset. And so now he's sitting during the morning proceedings with a headset, but he also took the headset off because it's not really the answer to what he's complaining about. What he would like to be able to do is participate in his own defense. And it goes to an issue of due process rights, of whether the accused can consult with their attorneys during a case. And the judge is putting the security of this counterterrorism courthouse in Woolwich, London, and saying that is more important than making a process that would allow Assange to consult with his attorney.
Walter, that's an astonishing thing. I mean, basically, they've set him in the middle of the courtroom in a bulletproof box. I mean, murderers and the works, I mean, and the likes get to talk to their attorneys, right? I mean, this is extraordinary.
It really is incredible. I mean, it completely deprives him of due process, of his right to defend himself, you know, a core part of due process. Now, I should add that at the conclusion of today's hearing, which sort of concludes this week's leg of hearings, it'll now pick back up again in late May, early June. There was a decision by the judge on this question of, you know, whether or not he remains in the box. You know, I was talking to Kevin midday. So the judge basically, so the judge said Julian Assange stays in the box. That's kind of the bottom line. And then she sort of offered these series of, concessions or half concessions, well, okay, maybe we could set up a bench or, this chairs like right next to the box and you can flip notes to each other. Or, it would be fine if Julian Assange wanted to take many, many breaks in the court hearings so that he could privately consult with his attorneys.
Yeah, but what's the
it's fine even if
justification
it
for the
takes
box?
extra weeks.
Like, what's the justification,
Yes.
though? Is it an issue we think somebody is going to take a shot at him? Like, what's the reasoning that they're giving that this man must sit in a box and can't necessarily consort with his defense? Because at one point he complained about them strip searching him, about the number of times they were handcuffing him, at other times where they were taking his notes during the trial, where they wouldn't necessarily, it's this notion of privacy with his lawyers seemed to just be out the window.
Sure. So here's the official reasoning, and it's so absurd. I mean, it's clearly there's something else going on here. But the official reasoning is that for Julian Assange to sit with his lawyers, that would require him to be granted bail. The judge is saying, well, when he's in the box, he's in the custody of the court. And if he wants to provide evidence, if he wants to testify, then he can come up to the dock. And then that counts as being in custody as well.
Are you serious? That's their argument?
Yeah, but at the table in the middle of this is all about one room. Middle of the room, that would require an application for bail that the court would have to consider.
Wow.
So right, that's clearly not real. I mean, what the UK government is obviously trying to do is portray Julian Assange as some dangerous terrorist, some criminal who needs to be restrained behind bulletproof glass. And to, make it very logistically difficult for him to coordinate with his legal team to make his legal defense less effective.
That's astonishing. So what are the takeaways for today? I mean, basically, the prosecution is continuing their argument that Julian Assange is not a political prisoner, which is strange to me. I mean, Julian Assange putting out information on torture or him on the political assassinations, or for that matter, even mass surveillance, all of those things were directed at the U.S. government's political tenor, especially in regards to foreign policy. How are they making this particular argument with a straight face that what Assange was doing did not amount to political actions?
Sure. Well, so they have two angles that they're attacking this question from. One that we heard more about yesterday and in previous days was this notion that the UK is not actually bound by the treaty that it signed with the United States because it wasn't subsequently passed by Parliament, written into English UK domestic law by an act of Parliament. And so even though there's an exemption for political cases in the US-UK extradition treaty of 2007, the domestic UK extradition law of 2003 doesn't have that exemption, and Parliament is sovereign, and that's what's enforced. So that's one part of their argument. Basically, international law doesn't matter at all. The UK is completely not bound by it.
Yeah.
Pretty shocking stuff. But what we heard more today is that, an argument along the lines of, okay, granted, let's say that there is an exemption for political cases. What Julian Assange was doing wasn't necessarily political. And so the legal standard that defines, well, what does it mean to be political, is that actions were taken with the goal of inducing the government to change its policy, to induce a change in government policy. And so what the prosecution was arguing is that, that's not what WikiLeaks was trying to do. But what the defense lawyer was arguing quite effectively, I thought, is that, of course, the WikiLeaks desire to induce a change in U.S. government policy. I mean, WikiLeaks has explicitly said that it's opposed to U.S. policy in Afghanistan. WikiLeaks stands for human rights around the world. And international law, that was being routinely trampled on by the U.S. government as revealed in these leaks that Julian Assange is now on trial for helping expose.
Yeah, it would be quite hard to be a fan of the U.S. foreign policy after you see all the stuff that WikiLeaks has been exposing over the years. That was Walter Smolarek live in London, continuing to follow Julian Assange's extradition hearing. You're listening to Political Misfits live in Washington, D.C. We're going to take a break before we come back with another hour of programming. Stay with us here. We're back after this.
listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Welcome back to Political Misfits on Radio Sputnik, where we bring you news, politics, and culture without the red and blue treatment. I'm Bob Schlaber here with Jamarl Thomas. Get ready to go against the grain. We got another hour of show with you. Lots to cover over the next hour, including the media finally seemingly taking Bernie Sanders and his supporters seriously, and if that's good for his campaign or not. We also want to talk about some of the recent suspensions of media contributors and the boundaries of what journalists can say off the job. Tweet us at Sputnik Misfits or give us a call at 202-521-1320, 202-521-1320. To start off this week, we got news that Dr. Jason Johnson, a fixture in MSNBC's Democratic primary coverage, has finally been benched by the network. Johnson has offered relentlessly anti-Sanders commentary for the network, as the Daily Beast reports. But then last week in an interview, not on MSNBC, but on Sirius XM's The Karen Hunter Show, Johnson said racist white liberals support Sanders, that Sanders has done nothing for intersectionality. And then the real piece, the resistance, slammed all the women of color working on the Sanders campaign. He says, I don't care how many people from the island of misfit black girls you throw out there to defend you. Yeah, not a great look, and apparently not a great look for MSNBC. MSNBC finally pulled him from the shelf and suspended him. We're joined by Glen Ford, executive editor of the Black Agenda Report, to talk about these media bombshells. Glen, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for the invitation. Sorry that my voice isn't up to par, but
it sounds strong enough for us, so thank you for powering through. We know you've had a long day here, so I'll talk a little bit more before we turn to you. I also wanted just to highlight the story that we talked about yesterday. Project Veritas released their latest undercover video. Not a big fan of Project Veritas, but what they caught in this video was ABC correspondent David Wright calling himself, Jamarl, a socialist. He called himself a socialist, not a democratic socialist, but a straight-out socialist. I think the problem ABC had, though, was when he started complaining about ABC's coverage of Donald Trump, saying basically we don't hold Trump account when we also don't give him credit for the things he does, and basically lamented that the network wasn't telling its viewers truth and doing what they should do. They're just trying to make money and sell ads.
That's why they benched him.
ABC suspended him, and the network said in a statement yesterday that any action that damages our reputation for fairness and impartiality or gives the appearance of compromising it harms ABC News and the individuals involved. Glenn, what should the guidelines be for reporters when they're off the clock? Do you think these suspensions are fair, or is fairness not even the right question to be asking?
well, the questions we should be asking should be about the ethics of all of the corporate media. And the corporate media has certainly in the last 4 years, just totally abandoned all of the ethics of journalism. They are gangbangers in working in cohort with each other, and so it's kind of funny when they dismiss some of their own people for violating journalistic ethics that they themselves do not share.
It's funny. When you look at people like Chuck Todd, or you look at some of the, or Brian Williams. Brian Williams, one who is lusting over bombs being shot into Syria for something that apparently didn't even take place. Like, you're right. I mean, these are the people who they have holding back the night. Fact is, Johnson is perpetually wrong, and yet they still keep him on that network regardless of how wrong he is. I mean, this is the same guy that said Sanders was going to be out by August, and we are going into the next year with Sanders potentially winning this thing. So
I suspect that Johnson was actually fired because he made some very politically incorrect and just plain incorrect statements about women and such that really had nothing to do with his blatant hostility to Bernie Sanders, because blatant hostility to Bernie Sanders is part of the job description.
That is part. What's funny, MSNBC came out recently saying, yeah, we're going to get some more pro-Sanders voices because, we're just losing credibility with because honestly, MSNBC at this point just looks like a wing of the Democratic Party. Am I wrong on that?
We keep on, and it's proper that we discuss the way the corporate media deals with this election and their lack of ethics, the unfair way that they treat Bernie Sanders. But Jesus, they commit much bigger crimes than that. Here we are, all of them, including at the CBS debate just a few days ago, talking about the grave crimes that Syria is committing in trying to reclaim part of its national territory in Idlib province. And they cry crocodile tears about the Syrian refugees in Idlib province. And basically, they are begging the U.S. government, begging Trump, to do something, meaning violate international law in Syria once again, and yet none of them even mention that Idlib province is totally controlled by Al-Qaeda. And this is the kind of lie that they tell by omission and commission, have been telling ever since 2011. So it's a whole decade of lies about U.S. complicity with Al-Qaeda in Syria and in Libya. And so, the ethical crimes against Bernie Sanders are serious, but the crimes that the corporate media is complicit in Syria regarding U.S. activities with Al-Qaeda are far, far worse.
Yeah, let's get a caller in here who has been patiently waiting. Jimmy, you wanted to talk to us. You are a self-described Trump supporter. What's on your mind today?
Yes, sir. Full disclosure, I'm all in for Trump. And, I kind of secretly like Bernie. He's spunky. He doesn't care what people say about him. He gets a little pissed when people heckle him. I like that. He's acting like a human. But, we got to go back to 2016, and let's face it, Bernie got cheated by a woman.
She got cheated by an entire party. Yeah, it was an entire
party.
machine and party.
It wasn't just the woman. Right.
But go on.
Correcting me. Keep correcting me. No, you are correct. You are correct. But she's the figurehead of all this stuff. I mean, come on.
That's fair. What's your point?
My point is, he supported the woman that cheated him. Why is anybody so surprised that they're going to cheat him again? Because I guarantee you, Bernie won't be the nominee.
You guarantee us. All right.
Jimmy, thank you for the call. You're going to have to call back.
Oh, wait a minute. I'm not even done.
Oh, all right. I'm going to give you 10 more seconds. Get someone got Glen Ford on the air.
Real quick.
Give you another 10 seconds here.
Comment.
Seconds. You've given me 30 seconds. So much for Trump supporters, right?
We're at 1:20 with you on the air here. Keeping facts here, Jimmy.
Yeah. So here's the difference. Everybody hated Trump in 2016. The Republicans came out in force. But the difference is they didn't cheat him. They did not cheat the man.
I agree.
Party cheated your guy, and they're going to cheat him again. So how are you a Democrat? I don't understand.
Oh, I'm not.
Some of us aren't Democrats. Jimmy, thank you for the call. We greatly appreciate. We're political misfits here. We're clearly.
We're not Democrats. I support my guy, but I'm specific in that support to Sanders. But as a Democrat, no, I revile that party. I agree with you. They cheated my guy, and I haven't necessarily forgotten that at all. And I would wager a lot of people haven't. And if they cheat him again, that's going to be the end of the party. Glenn, what do you think about the superdelegate thing? I mean, now that we're talking about the party, ultimately, superdelegates lining up. And look, I've not been. I've had no illusions about this. My argument has been that they care more about stopping Sanders because that's a fundamental change in the power structure of the party than they do to losing to Trump. But I think that also that would fundamentally destroy the party if they try to rip it away at the convention. What do you think about the brokered convention idea?
Well, I think that the oligarchs who actually control the party are prepared for the party to be split. I used to think that the split in the Democratic Party would come from the left, that here we have another chance for the Sandinistas to finally quit this corporate duopoly, after they get mauled by it, abused by it, in ways that this time around we can only imagine. But they will throw everything, including the kitchen sink, at Bernie this time. They're not even sure what they're going to do, but it will be horrific. But I think that it's probably more likely that the the Democratic Party will be split primarily because of initiatives coming from the right. Bloomberg is not running for president to win. I don't think that he's silly enough to think that he could win the Democratic nomination. But what he is doing is setting the stage to take over the party structure, so that even if miracle of miracles, there was a president, Bernie Sanders, the Democratic Party would still be firmly in the hands of corporate forces. And that's why Bloomberg has pledged these 500 campaign workers and organizers, all of them high paid because he pays well, to be put at the service of the Democratic National Committee, no matter who the nominee is. That's far more organizers than the Democratic National Committee can afford, and there's more money on the way. Bloomberg is going to enlist others among his oligarchy class to make sure that the DNC is totally staffed and backed by an army of oligarch-paid workers, and that all of the corporate-minded Democratic office holders in the House and Senate are backed up in their re-elections by oligarch money, and that any AOCs that pop up in the future will be beaten down with oligarch money. They're not going to lose control of one of only two of their governing parties. They already lost control of the Republicans to the undependable Trump, and launched a 4-year campaign of all but regime change against him. And they're not going to allow Bernie Sanders to take their other duopoly governing party from them.
Yeah, I think they're going to do everything in their power to stop Sanders on this.
But what does it look like at some point? I mean, what if he goes in to the convention in July in Milwaukee with a majority?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, what do you do? That's what I'm saying. What do you do then?
Yeah. I don't know what that looks like. I mean, I think they would try to burn that party to the ground if they tried to rip that away from Sanders like that. But what do you think happens?
Yeah,
what does that look like?
I mean, those conventions are so wild that you can't. In 2016, again, it was the most fascinating moment to me at that convention is when there was the anti-war chanters and they basically started out chanting USA, USA. And then the next day, they allegedly started pumping sound into the arena to silence out opposition to the Democratic Party.
Yes.
So those are just kind of like sneaky little things to do, right? And that's just like messing with the audience, but you're not actually messing with the actual voting process of delegates. And that's what's, I don't hold it against anybody. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if they tried something, but it's just like, what is it that they
And what does it look like? That's the question. What does it look like?
I think that the dark forces that oppose Bernie Sanders are willing to kill him. I don't think there's anything that they won't do. But I think that they are reconciled to the fact that there's going to be a split in the party, and that they are prepared.
But isn't the party already split, Glenn? I guess I talk a lot about that here in Washington, D.C. Myself and others have moved strongly away from the Democratic Party because we've been organizing against a mayor and a city council that doesn't stand for anything I was ever told growing up that the Democratic Party stands for. And so the activists and organizers working on homelessness, education, healthcare, jobs, public safety, all of those, we don't go to Democratic meetings anymore. The Democratic Party and the leadership here is split from us. They're not paying attention to any of the issues that are affecting the most vulnerable in the city. So that's split across America. You see more and more people going to DSA and other places. So there's one kind of just general nebulous split that's happened. And then what would a codified split look like? I mean, are Democratic Party officials having two separate meetings at the same time across town?
Oh, well, in fact, it probably will start like that. That's what I'm saying, that Bloomberg is strengthening the corporate part of the party, which is the DNC structures, making sure that all of the corporate politicians know where their money is coming from and that there will be plenty of it, and that gives them the spine to then resist even more firmly these progressives in encroachments, these progressives who think that they can take over the party from the inside. That's not going to happen. And in the process of doing that, and you can't move all these tons of money around secretly, that basically makes the contradictions more acute, leading to a split of the party rather than in the party.
Well, I don't think both can live together. I mean, ultimately, because right now, I argue for like a year there's a war in the Democratic Party. You could see it with Cherry Bustos and putting on or blacklisting any organization or company that works to get rid of an incumbent Democrat. You can see it. I mean, AOC.
So trending right now, primary Warren.
Oh, really?
Primary Warren
I don't blame.
is tracking
Look, if
right
she
now.
is against the democratic process because she believes in superdelegates, then fair enough. She's fair game to be primary, so she can understand what the democratic process looks like. But I guess for the DCCC, the DSCC, both of these organizations have taken to blacklisting people who run against incumbent Democrats. Like, this is severe. I mean, meaning that the only way for a Democrat to actually change is to lose to a Republican because they're disallowing this notion of, or trying to prevent this notion of incumbent insurgent campaigns like AOC or Ilhan Omar, or even to some degree Rouhani, from taking office. I agree with you. There is a war and a split in the Democratic Party. And like you said, the contradictions get that much more highlighted when the reckoning happens, where they have to make that choice on whether or not they outright steal it, meaning in the convention, they just take it, or whether or not they let it go past. I got to be honest, I'm in the mind that they may actually try to take it, even if it means destroying the party to do so.
And it's unsustainable, and that, I believe, again, is what Bloomberg is up to. He's already reconciled himself to the fact that he and his are not going to put up with Bernie and those. And so they're preparing for it already. But that's a good thing. It is good that the Democratic Party split. Especially it is good for Black America, because the duopoly is a trap. It's a trap for everybody, but it's especially a trap for Black people, because there is always one of those parties is always going to be the white man's party, and that's the role that the Republican Party has played since at least 1968, but there's always been a white man's party in U.S. politics, and that leaves only the other duopoly governing corporate party for Black people. And so here we have Black folks who are the most left-leaning constituency in the country, trapped in this one half of the duopoly where they cannot express their actual political ideology and aspirations. Instead, they feel that their role is to elect in primaries whatever Democrat they perceive as being the best bet to defeat the Republican. And in primary elections, that means that Black folks actually are the more conservative element of the party, because they're considering who everybody else is going to vote for in terms of beating who's best to beat the Republican, and not even their own ideology.
I always call it who keeps the monsters at bay.
This is a huge distinction of Black politics, and Black politics will not be free until it escapes from the Democratic Party.
That's Glen Ford, executive editor of the Black Agenda Report. You're listening to Political Misfits on Radio Sputnik. If you want to join us, give us a call at 202-521-1320, 202-521-1320. We have Charles on the line wanting to talk about the Democratic Convention. Charles, thank you for calling in today.
Hey, what's up, man?
What's happening?
Doing?
We're doing it.
Well, okay, well, this is kind of linked to what y'all was talking about right now. In 2016, the Pied Piper strategy that was did by Hillary Clinton to elevate Donald Trump, I think it was more nefarious than just making it so she could beat him in a general.
Explain.
It was more to guarantee that either him or her won, as opposed to making sure she could beat him. I believe they was like resting easy after they got rid of Bernie and all the other candidates. I think that this is a real plot by Clinton and Trump. I think they in cahoots together. I think she did win 2016 vicariously through Trump. And people not seeing it that way. They see them as oppositions, but they really friends. I never saw a real break in their friendship. I don't know why they all of a sudden ain't friends no more.
I don't
we'll leave
know,
it at that.
man.
Thank you so
that's a
much
tough
for the
one.
call, Charles.
Yeah, that's a tough one,
They're
Charles.
taking a lot of photos together there in the New York socialite scene there tomorrow.
I feel you, but I also Hillary Clinton is at this point just a professional bitter person, and every so often she drags her head out of a rock in order to just spit at the various people in the race, whether that's Sanders, whether that's Trump. I think she losing that race, I think burned. Like, I don't think that's a situation where she thought she was going to lose. I mean, think about what happened the day after, on the night that she was supposed to call in and agree that she lost. She didn't do that. She waited an entire day. That's something that never happens, and that it would have never been accepted for a guy to do that. You know, this concession speech. She waited a day after the concession speech. I actually felt bad for Clinton when Clinton lost that race, only because I know that in her head, I was going to, like 90% chance of winning it, and she lost.
Process played out.
Yeah, the process played out.
The other two people
Democracy.
there in that Pied Piper candidates there that were elevated, it wasn't just Donald Trump. It was also Ted Cruz and Ben Carson. Gives kind of a larger thought of what was in the minds of the Clinton campaign. We have another caller on the line. Ingrid, thank you for calling in. What's on your mind today?
Oh, thanks. I'd just like to be super devil's advocate for a minute.
Go for it.
I actually am a Tulsi supporter. Bernie, I think, is better than the rest, but not quite for me. I think you're overstating your case. Tulsi, for instance, says she thinks the person who has the most votes, namely a plurality, should be the candidate, and I disagree. At this point, you have Bernie almost 50%, but you have a majority of people who would prefer some centrist, some establishment Democrat.
Why do you think that?
Unless he comes in by a huge, if he has to breach 50%, he has to get like a whole lot. Otherwise, I think you're really overstating your case to say they're stealing with it.
But you do know.
Thank you, Ingrid, for the call. I
Ingrid.
really appreciate it.
There is no situation in a race where you say, all right, we're going to cobble together all of the moderates and then compare that moderate to the other candidate. That's not the way races and elections are run.
When I was in Iowa, Glen, I was talking to a lot of Buttigieg supporters who didn't like Joe Biden. Yeah. I mean, they wanted generational change. So these people that are voting, it's like half of Buttigieg's supporters just want generational change. So to think that they're just going to go with Joe Biden because he's the other moderate, that's not what these voters are thinking. It doesn't work out like that. Glenn, we covered a lot of ground there. Curious your thoughts on anything you heard.
Well, look, the way it appears is that Bernie is going to arrive in Milwaukee with so many delegates that the others are the Lilliputians.
I mean, to be fair, Nate Silver was given the next closest person with Joe Biden, and he had less than half. So you're right. You're absolutely right. Also, let's just
a convention in which the Democrats or the Republicans have nominated a Lilliputian and passed over the person with the great bulk of delegates. So, yes, of course, they are putting together the so-called centrists. Centrists are corporate. They know who they are, and they are determined that the corporate wing, was actually the dominant wing, corporate wing of the Democratic Party, not lose control of the DNC apparatus as well as being the nominee, because when you are the nominee, at least until you lose, you are supposed to be in control of the party apparatus. They're not going to give it up, and And there's developing a corporate consensus. We could see it in the corporate media that they should use all means necessary to stop Bernie. So we don't have to speak in terms of dark rooms and smoke-filled hush-hush conspiracies. They're conspiring in the full light of day in the pages of their newspapers and in their cable networks. So it's all out in the open, and every day of this bright light of day conspiring makes it more inevitable that the party break up.
A few other pieces of news as we pivot with about 5 minutes left with Glen Ford here. First, the U.S. House passes a bill to make lynching a federal hate crime. Actually reports that they've been trying to do this for 100 years.
That's
now,
amazing.
finally, the Emmett Till Act is expected to be signed into law. It's almost sickening in a way that like Emmett Till's name gets used in this way. Like, I guess it's good to keep a remembrance of this 14-year-old who was lynched after falsely being alleged to have whistled at a woman who later comes out and says, I made the story up.
Didn't happen.
And here we are 100 years later. Also, at the same time yesterday, we got confirmation of an order from the Marine Corps Commandant General David Berger that all Confederate-related paraphernalia to be removed from Marine Corps installations. Task and Purpose reporting on the story reminds us the question of whether Confederate symbols represent heritage or hatred has been vexing for the U.S. military. In January 2016, the Marine Corps refused to allow a man with a large tattoo of a Confederate flag to enlist, yet 10 Army bases are still named for Confederate generals. Glenn, I thought we had settled a lot of this stuff a long time ago, but as you mentioned, a long way to go here in the United States.
Well, it's really anti-climax. I want to point out first that in 2018, the House and the Senate passed a bill that made police a protected class and assault on police a federal hate crime. You see, that points up how anticlimactic the lynching law is, because most of the murders that we should classify as lynchings today in the United States are carried out by police. And in fact, we see this new era coming into play back in the 1960s with the Law Enforcement Assistance Administration, which began this process of funneling billions of dollars of federal monies to local police departments. When they did that, counties that had maybe one sheriff and a couple of paid deputies back in the day, all of a sudden had 20 or 30 paid deputies. Those deputies were the good old boys that used to lynch black folks. They became the sheriff's deputies. And so the lynching phenomenon in terms of public mass white mob lynchings passed into history, but that function was taken over by the cops. And now the cops have their own bill, which makes assault on them a federal hate crime. And that passed 2 years before the passage of the anti-lynching bill.
Yeah, I think that's, man, I mean, that gets across this kind of vision or this image of reality to some degree, that cops are a protected class, and then you finally get around to lynching 2 years after you allow cops who have a badge and a gun and can, for the most part, disrespect and remove you of your rights. They are a protected class, but African Americans not so much.
You got to protect the cops who are the actual lynchers before you outlaw lynching. Ain't that something?
Yeah, that's
wild stuff. That's Glen Ford. He's the executive editor of the Black Agenda Report. You can check all of their news out online. Glenn, thank you so much for joining us. We're going to go to another break before we do talk more about policing. Police now have drones they're using inside of buildings and homes. We'll take a look at that and much more in our weekly Trends with Benefits segment. You're listening to Political Misfits live in Washington, D.C. We're back after this.
Shooting from the lip.
We're taking no prisoners here. Real opinions for real people.
where we bring you people with controversial views, and instead of trying to catch them out,
we actually let them expand on their views.
What's going on in British politics, European politics, and indeed in world politics as well. And wherever you are, whether you're a UKIP supporter, a Tory or Labour, everything is in turmoil.
John Gaunt.
Shooting from the lip.
Hi, this is Max Kaiser. I'm here with Stacey Herbert, and we're doubling down.
Yeah, we're doubling down on crazy. We're doubling down on our new show called Double Down on Sputnik. It's doubling down on absolute joyous radio nirvana. You will love it. You will want to listen to every single episode on Sputnik. Bye, y'all.
Welcome back to Political Misfits on Radio Sputnik. It's time for our weekly Thursday segment, Trends with Benefits, where we look at the latest trends across the news and whether or not those trends will be friendly or harmful to you. Today, we are looking at the increased usage of technology, specifically drone technology, by police departments across the United States. Spoiler alert, Jamal. It's harmful. This week's Trends with Benefits are harmful to you. But Trends with Benefits, it always sounds like a great idea, and then you hear more about them. Not such a great idea. We're joined by Freddie Martinez, who is the director of Lucy Parsons Lab. Lucy Parsons Labs is a collaboration between data scientists, transparency activists, artists, technologists that operate in Chicago and the San Francisco Bay Area. Freddie, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having us.
So, Freddie, the reports that caught my eye here about 2 weeks ago, the Sacramento Police Department in California, according to policeone.com, has become the first police department in the country to use micro drones indoors. The small drones, which are outfitted with cameras, are designed to give officers a real-time view of crime scenes. There seems to have been a proliferation of drones in general used by police across the U.S. over the last year or so, and now this latest about smaller and indoor drones. How concerned should our listeners be about the usage of these new drones?
Right. Just for a bit of context, California, unlike some states, does not have any kind of regulation on the use of drone technology by police departments. And so what you're seeing is sort of these kinds of very experimental uses with sort of no kind of oversight regulation. And that should be like the first sort of warning sign that something's wrong here.
This puts me in mind of Minority Report, actually. Do you remember it's the movie with Tom Cruise, and they were looking for Tom Cruise and had the drones to go into the buildings to, scan the various people to ensure who this particular person was versus the person they were looking for. Is this what we're looking at? I mean, basically drones doing these kind of investigations, these invasive investigations into private spaces?
Well, again, I don't even think that they're doing investigations. Like I said, in California, because they have no regulations. For example, there was a protest at a jail near San Francisco, and at the end of it, the police department just deployed a drone for no reason. They claimed they collected footage. They claimed they never released the footage, and this was as the protest was breaking up. So I think like the issue is, I think we should be concerned because it's like not even like they're doing it for investigations. They seem to just be doing whatever they want to do, and that's really like troubling for lots of different reasons.
Yeah, I'm smirking a little bit because in my neighborhood, you'll often see these police officers riding around on Segways. And I went up to them one time. I said, "You guys look ridiculous on these things. What are you guys doing with them?" And they're like, "Oh, they're just laying around our office, the station. So we're just riding around." So if you give people toys to play with, they're going to go out and play with the toys. Like, It's just like, I don't know, the thing's sitting around. Let's see where we go. And Freddie, what's concerning about me is how these are presented. And we can talk a little bit more about some of the other tech tools that police have, but they're always presented in a way to keep people safe. And they're saying, well, look, one of the ways we can use it is at crowd control, specifically at protest. And I'm saying, well, most protests that I've been to are usually against the government. And so the government's going to keep me safe with government drones watching me from above to then inform the government to keep me safe. Like, no, of course not. The government doesn't have an interest in keeping me safe. We're out there protesting this region. And one of the reasons they said, look, the Stephon Clark shooting in Sacramento could have been avoided if we could have flown a drone around the corner of the house to see that Stephon Clark was holding a camera. The other way to avoid that situation was don't shoot him. That seems like the straight line one. There's also that. And the police also saying that another way that they can keep people safe is to basically with these drones at these protests, watch for agitators. And it's again like the number of stories we've heard about undercover police officers agitating itself. So they're just going to look for their own people. And often at these protests itself, people that get riled up if they're drinking or there's something else going on, or they're getting that's handled best by other activists and organizers within the space itself. It's not going to be by a drone seeing it. And so the lies that are rolled out, Freddie, that's what's always amazing, is what the propaganda that goes behind using these new tech tools.
Right. I mean, their argument is often something like, "Oh, we're going to use this to find missing children," or something like that. There seems to be a lot of missing children in the country or something. I don't know. But it's always very similar kinds of arguments, like, we're going to use this to protect civil rights and civil liberties. And what you find is, for example, in that case that I mentioned in the Bay Area, they just did it because they wanted to, like crowd intimidation. It's like the protesters breaking up. The policy that people were advocating for, the city actually enacted. So it's not clear, like, even what, like, their rhetoric doesn't match anything of what they're actually, doing. So I think we shouldn't take it at face value, but you look at the evidence, and it's even worse than what they're sort of saying.
What is your biggest concern with this? I mean, I have several concerns with this notion of civil liberties and everything else, but what is your biggest concern, especially, and it might even go beyond just using this particular drone. It may just be in the way that cops bring in technology in and of itself, and society gives them a pass on this stuff. I mean, think of the tanks and stuff that they were bringing in from other countries that we were using in war zones, and you would have somewhere like Mayberry with like 2 cops driving around in a Humvee in this kind of small town. And, like Bob said, the moment that you have the toys, you kind of want to use the toys. And maybe there needs to be a larger conversation on whether or not police should have these, the toys, and put restraints on the items that these guys are able to use in our society. What do you think about it?
I mean, I think generally what you're seeing across the country is people realizing that, violent crime is down, to its lowest levels in 30 years. And the idea that you need a Humvee to protect the public is sort of on its face absurd. And so the real question is what you should be doing. And so you're seeing across the country, different locations, New York, San Francisco, Oakland, their efforts in Boston. People really need, like, the community really needs to be saying, like, hey, you want a Humvee to, like, bring out to the 4th of July parade? That doesn't seem right. And so you're seeing community groups sort of organizing to just say, like, you need at least very basic. Like, that's not a radical idea to be saying, like, hey, I need some input on this decision. And so just giving law enforcement unfettered access to whatever decisions they want to make, I think basic community oversight is not even that radical of an idea. It's probably like just the first step in what we need to be doing.
Yeah, it's quite amazing too, the technology, Jamar. Just looking into this story about what drones are able to do. There was watching a video where these 2 drones basically can fly around an enclosed space, so a building or just like a brick wall, and one will transmit Wi-Fi signals and the other one will receive those Wi-Fi signals, and basically if they can map it properly, they can see the strength of the Wi-Fi signal as it moves the 2 drones up and down the space, and then it tells you then basically based on signal strength what is inside that building. And so again, it goes back to like 4th Amendment protections, the not being having police search your property. If they can come to a point, as Freddie's saying, in California, there's no law about flying over private property of taking drone footage, and if you can fly around it but you're staying at the street or off the person's property, you can find out exactly who is in somebody's house without ever having to get a warrant. And so those privacy questions are of concern. I also wanted, Freddie, to have you talk a little bit about what you guys are doing at Lucy Parsons' lab around international mobile subscriber identity catchers, best known as stingrays. A story or two out here, Jamar. Welcome to D.C. There's stingrays all around the White House, and if you drive this area and you have a stingray detector, you'll see that there's a bunch of these devices happening. So your phone is constantly being tracked by third parties. So Freddie, maybe tell us a little bit more about what stingrays are and the rate in which they're used.
Yeah. So so when your phone transmits. It transmits basically your phone number plus some other identifying information. And if you wanted to track someone's phone location, or person, more correctly, you're tracking a person because they keep their phone on at all times, you could basically set up a fake cell phone tower. Your phone connects to it, and then you can sort of figure out who's in a given area, the density. As they're moving across the city, you could probably track them throughout the city. And so for the longest time, there were no protections on this sort of data being collected by law enforcement. And so for about a decade, they were doing precisely this. So like in Chicago where we did this work, we were finding, warrantless use of cell phone technology. We were finding, judges signing off on, judges, they hear that they're being told that this is a digital analysis tool, so they're signing off on warrants that they have no sort of practical oversight over. And so we spent years sort of fighting these court battles to get very basic oversight on it. And eventually the state passed a law that said you have to get a warrant. This was before the Supreme Court decision that happened in 2018. And so after that happened, we spent about a year trying to figure out how often they were getting these warrants. And to date, we've gotten 0 copies of warrants in Illinois, specifically in Chicago. So again, even the basic questions of like what where, we can't answer those questions. So we're pretty much stuck in the same kind of situation we were in, 2015, except now that they're supposed to be getting a judicial warrant, but we have no practical means of tracking that.
Yeah, it's crazy. In 2019, they found Stingray technology near the Washington, D.C., the White House here in Washington, D.C., and according to officials, it was pretty clear that it was the Israeli government who had put it there.
I heard about that.
If the Russian government was found to have Stingray technology anywhere, mind-blowing, but it was the Israelis, and so obviously not a big deal there for anybody, and just pass it along. Freddie, I'm curious, I don't know if Jamar's got other questions on this line, just other technology pieces there. Obviously, we can talk about the 1122 program, which allows U.S. municipalities to purchase drones, purchase big armored trucks, military equipment from the federal government. Stingrays, drones, where else should we be keeping an eye on?
Facial recognition technology is a huge concern that we're seeing more and more of. Just last month, the New York Times had a, front page story about a company that was collecting profiles of people, Facebook, Twitter.
Homeless, I thought, right? I mean, they were using the homeless in order to evaluate the efficacy of the facial software, or are we talking about different stories?
This is a different story.
Okay.
There is a company that was basically collecting every image they could find online, and then they were selling this data to law enforcement. And so they would run facial recognition and say, "Oh, I think we've identified this person's Facebook." You to this building really kind of detailed maps of people, and just kind of collecting this data with no consent, no one's knowledge. And so now you're seeing sort of Congress stepping in and lawsuits against this company, just because of what they've been doing is just so out there, so unheard of.
This gets into this notion of
privacy.
Clearview
AI is the company you were referencing there.
Clearview. Oh, thank you. This gets into privacy concerns, right? This notion that we don't control our own information, and apparently including our own visage.
I mean, I think privacy concerns are a huge thing, but even just like that's obviously true. There are privacy concerns here, but even the kind of basic informed consent that not only that law enforcement has these tools, but then also that they're they've collected photos of you off of Venmo and YouTube. That kind of discussion, it's sort of the privacy discussions can't even begin without sort of the informed that this company Clearview AI exists.
Yeah.
Which is part, at least even half the game.
Yeah, I'm kind of always curious with this stuff too. I mean, I think so much about what Cambridge Analytica was able to do with large data that it was able to take from Facebook, and now you have companies like Clearview AI and others that can basically access entire profiles, faces of people, all of this, track you, set up portfolios, you have stingrays, all this technology. This, for me, feels like a threat to democracy and basic people's liberties, and yet it's not framed in this great concern. I mean, even the Julian Assange trials that are going on of what he showed that the U.S. government tracking and maintaining these huge data files on all of us, and yet it's become normalized in a way that is, I don't know if it's confusing to me. Disturbing. I mean, the arc of acceptance for this, Freddie, is just mind-boggling.
Yeah, I mean, and I think that's why it's important for people to continue to do investigations and things like that. I mean, I think a lot of these vendors, these tech companies, would just love for everything to just sort of get put, buried under, buried under a headline for one or 2 days, and then everyone moves on. But thankfully, I mean, I think we have seen some positive trends, like some municipalities are like banning the use of facial recognition technology. So if federal government is going to step in, or concerned citizens are step, it seems like there are at least some places, some pockets where people are taking this stuff seriously.
Well, Freddie, thank you so much for joining us. You've been listening to Freddie Martinez, the director of Lucy Parsons Lab. You can check out all of their great work online. Freddie, thank you so much for joining us. It's greatly appreciated. You're listening to Political Misfits. We got one more break before we come in with coronavirus updates and whether or not you feel better that Mike Pence is now in charge of the United States' reaction to the virus. I'm a little concerned, for one. We're going to take a quick break here on Political Misfits live in Washington, D.C. We're back after this. So, Sean, what do you want to talk about today?
Well, Bob, that's easy. I want to talk about the need to stop the development of self-driving cars.
Again, Sean, you're driving me nuts. I think the self-driving car thing's already out of the gate.
No. It's never too late. See, now the leading experts in the field, I mean, just pick one, whichever one, leading experts have repeatedly warned us about the dangers of artificial intelligence. Look, I'm telling you, man, we have to stop the robots by any means necessary.
I see what you did there.
Yep.
Tune into our show By Any Means Necessary daily from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern Time on Radio Sputnik. And don't forget to call in at 3:20 p.m. to our studio number 202-521-1320.
And if you miss us live, check us out on SputnikNews.com, Spreaker, iTunes, iHeartRadio, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts to stay up to date on the latest political, social, and economic movements shaping the world around us.
Welcome back to the last 15 of Political Misfits on Radio Sputnik, where we bring you news, politics, and culture without the red and blue treatment. My name is Jamal Thomas. I'm here with my co-host, Bob Schlehuber. You can tweet us at Sputnik Misfits or call us at 202-521-1320. That's 202-521-1320. Let us know what you're thinking, how you feeling. So, we have one comment. Judas Priest, being a fellow Trekkie, Jamal, I'd like to get your take on S.A. Corey's The Expanse. It's the same time as Picard, only follows the laws of physics, free to prime members with no commercials. I don't have a huge amount of experience with The Expanse, if I'm being entirely honest.
Is that a real person, or is that a paid advertisement from Amazon Prime?
No, that's actually, Judas Priest is a real person.
Oh, okay.
Believe it or not, he
check out this other show
at
at the same time of a show you like on another network. That's even better.
Yeah, The Expanse is not bad, but I have a hard time getting into it. But it's not bad. It's not a bad show. So yesterday, Donald Trump announced his appointment of who would run the United States regarding the coronavirus. Who do you think he picked, Bob? Let's listen to the clip, but who do you think he picked, Bob?
Well, I know who he picked.
All right, so let's listen to the clip. The audience may not know.
Himself.
Let's hear the clip.
That I'm going to be putting our Vice President, Mike Pence, in charge. And Mike will be working with the professionals, doctors, and everybody else that's working. The team is brilliant. I spent a lot of time with the team over the last couple of weeks, but they're totally brilliant. And
can you imagine being an epidemiologist and sitting there having to like seriously talk about the coronavirus with Donald Trump in the room? Of just like,
not to mention the person who's running point is pray the gay away, Mike Pence. that's astonishing.
What's his record there in Indiana as well on other diseases and management?
On other issues? Well, this is news caused some snickering as Pence is famously anti-science. That's an understatement. While he was governor in Indiana in 2015, the state saw its worst HIV outbreak, for example, which critics blamed on Pence's belated response and his opposition to authorizing a needle exchange program. I keep saying ideology is a poor substitute for reality, and this is another example of that. If you aren't feeling good about Mike Pence being in charge, the state of the political bickering in D.C. should also have you a bit concerned. First, Nancy Pelosi, and rightly so, said Donald Trump is not competent enough to oversee the COVID-19 response.
Fair. That sounds fair.
That sounds entirely fair. Well, Donald Trump feels the same way about Nancy Pelosi. Here's a response to a question at the press conference yesterday on what he thought of Pelosi calling him incompetent. She thinks you're incompetent, sir. How do you respond to that?
What is your response to Speaker Pelosi, who said earlier today that you don't know what you're talking about the coronavirus? I'm also wondering if you want to address critics who think can't be trusted about what your administration is saying.
Sure. I think Speaker Pelosi's incompetent. She lost the Congress once. I think she's going to lose it again. She lifted my poll numbers up 10 points. I never thought that I would see that so quickly and so easily. I'm leading everybody. We're doing great. I don't want to do it that way. It's almost unfair if you think about it. But I think she's incompetent, and I think she's not thinking about the country. And instead of making a statement like that, where I've been beating her routinely at everything, instead of making a statement like that, she should be saying we have to work together because we have a big problem potentially, and maybe it's going to be a very little problem. I hope that it's going to be a very little problem, but we have to work together. Instead, she wants to do that same thing with crying Chuck Schumer. He goes out and he says,
that's good. Yeah, he goes all over the place. I like to do that. Instead, he's like, well, let me prove that I'm competent and talk about the disease in depth and what we're actually doing around the country to prevent an outbreak. Let me talk to you about politics and poll. Like what? Like no, that's not help. That's not helping anybody.
I love how easy he calls her incompetent.
She's incompetent.
Well, she calls him incompetent, and he turns around and says, no, she's incompetent. She's been helping my poll numbers magnificently.
I heard she doesn't even pray for me at night either. Like she said she does. She said she prays. She doesn't do. I know she doesn't do that.
That's Pelosi's lying. I love that. So to put it in context, meanwhile, CNN reports that the California resident who has novel coronavirus might be the first example in the country of a community spread of the virus in the United States. What this means is that the patient did not have a relevant travel history or exposure to another known patient. The U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention said Wednesday the person exposure is, quote unquote, the exposure is unknown, the CDC said in a news release. It is possible that this could be an instance of a community spread of COVID-19, which will make it the first time this has happened in the United States, the agency said, using the name of the World Health Organization gave the coronavirus. Look, I do think Donald Trump is incompetent, so I'm not shocked by that. Pelosi did help his poll ratings, so that's entirely true. I mean, this impeachment thing was lunacy.
What does that have to do with COVID-19?
Not one thing. Not one thing. None of that has anything to do with whether or not we're prepared for the virus. And the latest, the pathogen has now invaded, this is according to the New York Times, 47 countries, with California and Germany recording its first cases with no obvious source of transmission.
Yeah, that's what's terrifying. Is people are walking around that are infected that either don't know it themselves or haven't removed themselves from the population, and now all of a sudden you're not able to figure out where the one person was able to get it from.
Yeah, that's astonishing. China was able to build a hospital in 10 days. I mean, but again, that's somewhat of an authoritarian regime that, for the most part, can take policy like that. I got to be honest. I don't know what the United States does if there's a major outbreak and whether or not we were prepared for that major outbreak.
Yeah. Just on a side note, that shows you the quickness of which a hospital can be erected. The fact that how quickly we could solve most of societal ills around homelessness, for example. If you needed to build housing rapidly and quickly, you could do it. You could do it.
You could do it.
And so this whole notion, there's not enough money, there's not enough infrastructure, it's not real. None of that's real.
Yeah.
Stop telling me that we don't have enough money to end homelessness when it's possible. If there's a ton of luxury condos around the country that are sitting there empty because billionaires around the world are just looking for places to hide their money in large capital projects. Don't talk to me about not being able to house homeless people.
Pretty much.
When we can do this stuff, if there's an urgent need to it, or if your life's fine, if all of a sudden there's a need for you to address it so you're safe, then you can help the person that needs help. And that's what happened real quick. We have another call. We have a call here. Tyrese, thank you for calling in here at the end of our show. What's going on today?
Good morning, gentlemen. Good afternoon.
It's morning somewhere.
Yeah, that's right. It's morning somewhere.
Yeah, I remember watching you speak a couple of days ago. It was you and your wife, Mr. Jamal.
Yes.
And I was talking about Bernie Sanders needs security. We had those bare-naked women jumped on stage.
Yeah. I mean, we didn't know what that woman was carrying in her breasts. Did you see that? It's
No, I
those
didn't
naked
see it.
women jumped on stage. It was for animal thing. And I was kind of making a point that could have been a false breast. You know, she could have had a weapon hiding in that when she just kind of pulls out and attacks Sanders. We don't know. We can't take these chances. Glen Ford had just said somebody might try to off him. George Galloway said the same thing. What would be more inconspicuous than a woman naked running on
I don't
stage,
know, I'm not buying it.
hiding
I
a
didn't see
club
this.
in
That's
her breast, right? False breast, a fake breast. Well, go ahead. I'm sorry. Go ahead, Tyrese.
Yeah, man, yeah, because I just noticed that, and that kind of, I thought about it, what you say, because I saw it before you spoke about it.
Yeah.
And I didn't think nothing of it. And when you brought it up, then it finally hit me. I said, what's going on here? I mean, you don't have no proper security. Then you got this deep state can't stand him, and they can't stand Trump. So you have two people be on stage going at it with each other.
Yeah.
Right? They will actually tell you, the public, what they want to hear and probably do it because they're going to have no choice but to do it. The deep state can't handle all that.
You know, the wild part.
Tyrese, thank you so much for the call. Greatly appreciated.
It took like 30 seconds before security got on stage. I mean, basically, and the woman with no shirt on, bare as the day she was born, goes running after Sanders, and Sanders goes running off stage being chased by this naked woman. It is so bizarre to watch. And all of this was supposedly to get across this notion of vegetarianism. You know what's not going to put me into the mind of vegetarianism? Chasing my guy bare naked on stage, trying to get him to stop.
You're talking
eating
about it
milk.
today, though, doesn't it?
We are talking about it, but does anybody on the sound of the voice thinks, you know what, I'm going to totally do the vegetarian thing? Like, for example,
I don't know.
if
There's
they
like no
would've
good way to like interrupt or disrupt. If that's your path, you want to just chant. I mean, you got attention. It's going to get some news stories. What's the thing? And so even if you already support that position, at least you're like riled up because you got some attention.
What if, but think about it from the other standpoint. He's taking questions from a town hall. If they would have went to her and she was like, just throw everything off and stands there naked as a jaybird, would she still get the attention? The answer is yes. She would still get a certain degree of publicity for her particular cause if she just wanted to get butt naked right there in the town hall thing. You didn't have to get on stage and chase him. The issue that we were having was the security issue. It was like, where is security where you stand on the stage to prevent your guy from being effectively assaulted by a bunch of naked people? And what if there was a guy going after Warren or Klobuchar? What if that was a guy?
Sorry, I didn't know if you wanted, what if?
What
if?
Just swinging, running after Klobuchar or Warren. I guess my point is that would not be tolerated. On the flip side, it shouldn't necessarily be tolerated in the other way.
Yeah, some good news to maybe end our show on here. U.S. drops charges against Scott Warren, who aided migrants crossing the desert. If you remember, in Arizona, federal prosecutors on Wednesday dropped a misdemeanor charge against the humanitarian aid volunteer 1 day before he was to be sentenced for driving on protected land to drop water, food, and other aid to migrants crossing the Sonoran Desert. The single misdemeanor count was the last charge faced by Scott Warren, who at one point faced up to 20 years in federal prison for felony charges of harboring migrants after he provided food, water, and shelter to a pair of men who barely survived their journey into the U.S. So if the laws here don't get you, Jamal, they'll get you on the way into the United States or trying to, and targeting somebody who is trying to provide food, water, and shelter. The U.S. government wanted to show somehow that was illegal.
That's amazing. Yeah, that's amazing. That's as bad as doing the thing where they prosecute people for showing what's taking place as opposed to what's taking place, whether it's the animal agriculture things where they have those laws to get people for showing cows being abused or kicked or animals being maligned and injured.
Or if you think about the person that videotaped Eric Gardner getting strangled to death, they try to basically track him down and get him for other things in relation to send him to jail.
Isn't that mind-blowing? It's like, it's not the crime, it's the fact that you recorded the crime and that you're saying something about the crime. I mean, the same thing with Chelsea Manning. Chelsea Manning, right now, they're torturing her in prison to try to roll on Julian Assange in regards to trying to get some kind of evidence on Assange. This is the second time she was being tortured, once by the military and now by our own laws.
Well, big thank you for everyone who joined us and called in today. Thank you for our guests, Jason Zubo, Glen Ford, and Walter Smolarek. Walter will be back with us tomorrow covering the latest from London in the Julian Assange extradition hearing. Big thank you again, for listening. We're going to be back with a brand new show tomorrow. I'm Bob Schleber here with Jamal Thomas on Political Misfits. Go out and organize. We'll see you next time.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.